There we go.
All right. So as everybody knows, in this time in the election cycle, ballot access is a huge issue for the Green Party. It's damned hard in this country. And when we do get on the ballot, we're marginalized by the spoiler effect of the winner-take-all system that generates our exclusive two-party system. So today we're going to talk about electoral reforms that Greens can campaign on to replace the exclusive two-party duopoly with an inclusive multi-party democracy. And the reforms we're going to talk about include the Fair Election Act for fair ballot access, the Ranked Choice Voting in Presidential Elections Act, and more than that, about that question, the Fair Representation Act for proportional ranked choice voting in multi-state districts for proportional representation in Congress, and then why we should oppose the top 4 plurality primaries on the ballot in several states in this election. So I am joined by a group of all-stars when it comes to the electoral reform movement in the United States. So I'm going to introduce them in order of speaking. They'll each go for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have question and answers afterwards and comments. So hold them until the end. So I'm going to give the first presentation. I'm Howie Hawkins. I've been active in the Green Party since our first national organizing meeting 40 years ago this August in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I've been pretty busy since then, including running as our presidential candidate in 2020. And I will talk about the Fair Election Act for fair ballot access. Rob Richie, who, give us a wave, Rob, so people can see you. Well, he's smiling. There he is. He's been the nation's leading advocate and organizer for ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and other pro-democracies since he co-founded Fair Vote in 1992. And he's going to speak on ranked choice voting for the presidential election, and he thinks we can do it by 2028. And then Lynne Serpe, who most of you have heard from, is she's coordinating this convention. She's a political educator, organizer, and campaign consultant who has been a Green Party member since 1994 and has worked on many winning electoral campaigns and electoral reform campaigns throughout the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And she's going to talk about proportional representation in Congress. And then Mike Feinstein is he's a former mayor and city council member in Santa Monica, California. He ran for the Secretary of State of California in 2018 on a platform of ranked choice voting and proportional representation. And he's going to present the case against top 2, 4, or 5 multi-partisan primary winner, plurality winner primaries. That's a mouthful. But anyway, so I'll start with fair ballot access. And, you know, right now we're all struggling to get Jill Stein on the ballot in many states. Fair ballot access has always been one of the central demands of the Green Party. I remember Ralph Nader in his stump speeches in 2000, he would cite a 1948 proposal by the ACLU that we need federal standards for fair ballot access in federal elections. And then he would highlight the bill I'm talking about, the Fair Election Act, which John Conyers introduced in 1989. And what I'm going to say is we should bring that bill back and make it an issue in all of our congressional districts. In this Fair Elections Act, and I'll put the link in the chat when I'm finished talking, to the act itself, the maximum signature requirement for any election, federal election, was 1,000 signatures, or signatures of 1/10 of 1% of the votes for that office in a previous election, whichever is greater. So that's a lot lower than the standards most of us face running for Congress, let alone statewide. And then the vote required in this bill for a statewide party candidate to get the party qualified on the ballot was 20,000 votes statewide, or 1% of the votes cast for any statewide office in the preceding election for it's for president or senator, and whichever is less, either the 20,000 or the 1%. And again, you know, do the math, compare that to your own states, and you'll find out that these standards are far lower than in most states. And if they were the standard, the Green Party would be on the ballot in every state. And, you know, let's think about this by applying this standard to running for the House in this country compared to other countries. Current petitioning requirements to run as an independent is really high in a lot of states. In my state of New York, it's 3,500. In Illinois, it's over 15,000. In Georgia, over 20,000. Alabama, over 40,000. Alabama over 30,000. Indiana, over 40,000. And compare that to running as an independent in other countries for the parliament. Their parties get to nominate and put their candidate directly on the ballot. But if you want to run as an independent, for the House of Commons in Great Britain, it takes 10 signatures. For the New Zealand Parliament, it takes 2 signatures. For India's Lok Sabha, which is their lower parliament, lower house, 10 signatures. Australia, 100. Canada, 100 or 50 in their rural ridings, their rural districts. The German Bundestag, 200. We have to get thousands or tens of thousands. And in most other countries, it's a relative handful and no more than a couple hundred. So I don't want to go over my time. I was going to tell you about Putin's Russia. It's pretty bad there, but it's even worse here. So even the Conyers bill has higher standards than in most countries. But if you think about those standards, it's a lot easier than what we have now. So I'm arguing that this Fair Elections Act, and I'm going to put the link to it in the chat, is something that we should inject in House elections this year. And of course, in following years, we can do it now through extra parliamentary actions. You know, meet with these congressional candidates, organize a public meeting and invite them, demonstrate outside their candidate headquarters, meet with labor unions and community organizations about the bill, raise it inside or outside of candidate debates, depending on the format, banner drops, leafleting, skywriting. You can be creative, but we can inject this now. And of course, when we have our own candidate putting this into the election, our own candidate for the House, we have a lot more leverage because then they can't take our votes for granted. But I think this is something we can do, and it's something we need to do because that elections bill in 1989 went nowhere. It was referred to a couple committees and was buried there without any hearings. It did have 37 co-sponsors. Most of them were members of the Congressional Black Caucus, which was more progressive in those days, along with some other progressives, including even Nancy Pelosi when she was younger in her second term. But the Democrats are not going to lead on fair ballot access. They haven't done anything in the 35 years since this bill was introduced. So it's up to us, the Green Party, to bring back the Fair Elections Act and force this issue of ballot access onto the national agenda by making it an unavoidable issue in House elections across the country. So I'm going to put the bill in the chat and turn it over now to Rob Richie to talk about how we can work for ranked choice national popular vote for president.
Thank you, Howie. And that was tight. That was a model short presentation. So I'll try to be focused. And I suspect most of you on the call know what ranked choice voting is. It has had such a sea change of growth in this country, really is the fastest growing electoral reform by some definitions in its progress these last 10 years since, you know, cities were using it, often triggered by working with local Greens. But then it rose to states, you know, passed in Maine. They now use it for president. So when Howie ran for president in 2020, they used ranked choice voting. And now it's in Alaska for president also. So ranked choice voting, you know, rather than the typical single choice ballot, you get to do more. You get to say who your second and third choice is, and those votes really become your power to making your vote count. And there really isn't any other single change that makes more votes count in decisive elections and kind of has at least create the conditions for opening up elections. For president, it is a state-by-state decision. Congress can't require states to use ranked choice voting. They can create incentives. They can do carrots. They can pass it for congressional elections, and actually a bill is being introduced by Jamie Raskin in the House and Senator Welch in the Senate next month to establish ranked choice voting for all U.S. Senate and U.S. House elections, which of course would make it pretty straightforward for states to add it for president. But it is a state-by-state move. And it is one that I think is creating, it seems more plausible as we win ranked choice voting in more places and scale it to higher levels of election, using it for statewide elections becomes a more straightforward enterprise. And then it's a policy debate. Then it's like Howie was saying, push on ballot access, but push for ranked choice voting. And there are, in practical terms, for deciding the presidency, it's really only a handful of swing states where that happens under the current electoral college system. And so getting ranked choice voting in just a handful of swing states essentially defangs this whole spoiler debate and kind of makes it easier to just recognize that you can vote the way you want anywhere you are. And that's, I think, within reach. It's not easy reach, but I think it's within reach in a number of swing states, and certainly extending it to more states. It's on the ballot this year, ranked choice voting in statewide elections that would directly affect president in Oregon and Washington, D.C. It is sort of indirectly on the ballot in a way that affects statewide elections, or that could affect the presidential election in Nevada, Colorado, Idaho, and what am I missing? Nevada, Colorado, Idaho. Oh, and it's being defended in Alaska. But that's the top X model, this top 4 model that Mike is going to be critical of. I would just say briefly that model has a lot of allies. And so for those who want to see ranked choice voting expand, it is like from a voter-centric way, and for affecting kind of pro-environment candidates, I think there's a lot to say to it. I can understand why minor parties feel threatened by it, but it is one that at least is really pushing ranked choice voting forward and adding to numbers of cities and states that are doing it. So say if all these ones passed it, I would expect, say in Nevada, to just add ranked choice voting for president, just because it would be a logical way to invite voters who are using ranked choice voting in all their other statewide elections to use it for president also. I'll say that, Lynne's going to talk about the Fair Representation Act for Congress, and that's our North Star at Fair Vote. That's adding the proportional form of RCV, or requiring it for all U.S. House races, and adding RCV for all Senate races. The Ranked Choice Voting Act just essentially pulls the ranked choice voting element out of it, and really the only difference is that it doesn't change to multi-member districts, doesn't go to PR, but it can also be implemented faster. So it is, as proposed in the bill, would actually require this change by 2028. That's a lift, but it's actually getting, I think it's going to get that conversation just heightened, and I think Raskin and Welch are two strong messengers for that. Just on a couple specifics of the Ranked Choice Voting Act, it would, among other things, allow states to do the top X kind of primary, but they couldn't do top 2. So a state like California or a state like Washington that only allow 2 candidates to the November ballot, they would have to do at least 3. And of course, we would hope that they would do more if they're doing that system. And it would have ranked choice voting in the primary. So every primary would always have RCV, whether it's a nonpartisan primary or whether it's a separate party primary. On presidential elections, just one part of what Howie and I have talked about some over the years is the National Popular Vote Plan, something I've worked a lot on. And this is an interstate compact. The Greens have supported this, and it is a change that's sort of based on the fact that it's states that control presidential elections, not Congress. So states have established the current electoral college rules in their state. The fact of the electoral college is in the Constitution, but how states allocate electors is not. And so we're up to 17 states, most recently Maine, that have passed the National Popular Vote Plan. And those states are agreeing to act collectively in concert to give all their electoral votes to the winner of the National Popular Vote, the candidate who wins all the votes in all 50 states in DC. And to do so, though, only when they're decisive. So they have to represent a majority of the Electoral College, because when they reach that threshold with the number of states in the compact having a majority of the Electoral College, that candidate is guaranteed to win. It does work with ranked choice voting. Maine's a good example. If the compact goes into place, they will define Maine's popular vote by what happens after the ranked choice voting tally. So the ranked choice vote in Maine would always be respected. There's kind of an even further way you could go, where you could actually do a whole ranked choice voting compact on top of that, but they can coexist. So there's sort of within we're within reach to actually go to a popular vote for president, ranked choice voting in a lot more states, ideally moving to all states, so much further than where we were not that long ago. And I think as I sort of see the movement out there and see like so many state groups working on ranked choice voting right now, and all the cities kind of doing it, colleges, we're up to more than 100 colleges and universities where students have just organically decided to add it for student elections, and young people, when it's on the ballot, typically vote for this 75, 80%. It's where we're heading. It's a matter of this getting from here to there. And that's not easy, but the Green Party plays a big role in how that gets talked about, the case for it. And your candidates for president have always been incredible messengers for it also. And so look forward to engaging in the conversation here. And I think I'm passing it off to you, Lynne, to talk about the Fair Representation Act.
Well, thank you. So I am going to talk about the Fair Representation Act, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about proportional representation first. And I'm going to do that by telling a little bit of story about how I came to learn about proportional representation, get excited about proportional representation, and why I'm still a big fan of PR to this day. So back in 1994, August of 1994, almost exactly 30 years ago, I got involved with a campaign in New Mexico with a candidate named Roberto Mondragon, who was running for governor. He had been the Democratic Party lieutenant governor, I think one of the highest ranking Latino candidates in the state up until that point. And it was a very exciting campaign. It was multi-racial, multi-ethnic, across all sort of backgrounds, ages, etc. Incredibly exciting. But then as we got closer and closer to election day, people did start worrying about votes being, split, or votes going to the Greens and, quote unquote, spoiling the election. And it turned out that that didn't happen. Mondragon got about 10.4%, which is an amazing result in a first statewide race. But we did not, in fact, spoil or split the vote. Fast forward into 1995, I helped organize the annual national meeting in Albuquerque. And it's at that point where I learned about ranked choice voting and proportional representation. So one of the co-founders, along with Rob Richie of the Center for Voting and Democracy, the precursor for Fair Vote, was there and gave a presentation similar to what we're doing today. And it was there I learned that there was a solution, which was called ranked choice voting, to the problem we had just experienced in a single member seat. And I thought that was great, but what got me very excited was this idea of proportional representation, which roughly is just that seats are won in proportion to level of support. So the proportional ranked choice voting that Rob referred to, and here in the United States, it's often called now PRCV. In other parts of the world, it's referred to as single transferable vote. And the acronym for that is STV, which can be an unfortunate acronym, although on many campaigns I've worked on, we've used it as kind of like STV, it's spreading. STV, not a disease, it's the cure. So even an unfortunate acronym can be spun in the right way. So with STV, what I wanted to mention is that it is both proportional and preferential. So to me, it's a great system. And it can also be used in both partisan and nonpartisan elections, because what you're doing is you're ranking candidates in your order of preference. So most of the people on this call are third-party activists, specifically with the Green Party. And certainly we are looking at creating and building a party that people want to vote for. And then we're looking at trying to promote reforms so that those votes count and that they matter. And that's fantastic. But there are elections around this country that are nonpartisan, and there are a growing number of people who do not affiliate with a political party. So the freedom and flexibility that STV or PRCV allows for people to be able to rank candidates in their order of preference based on what other kind of constituency they might feel most directly impacted by, whether it's their race, their gender identity. It's kind of whether or not they're a climate activist, an animal rights activist. I mean, at this point, the idea is to be representative. So proportional representation is to be representative. And so I just really wanted to underscore that because I think it's important. There are many different types of proportional voting systems, but this particular one, PRCV, proportional ranked choice voting, where just like in single member ranked choice voting, the voter just ranks the candidates in their order of preference. We used to always say, IRV or STV or RCV, easy as 1, 2, 3, because that really is what voters do. So I want to also talk a little bit about my experience in these other countries, because I worked as the national STV coordinator for the New Zealand Greens in Parliament. I have worked on a number of campaigns in Australia which use STV. STV, single transferable vote, and I'll post comments in the chat when I'm done making my presentation, definitely. So Australia uses STV. New Zealand actually uses the mixed member form of proportional representation at the national level, MMP. But while I was their national STV coordinator, and the goal was to try to get STV being used in local elections, district health board, and local territorial authorities, what we think of as city councils. After that, I went to British Columbia, and they had a provincial referendum on BC STV. And at this point in time, it was exciting. This was the early 2000s. There seemed to be a lot of momentum. Things were growing, things were building. In British Columbia, we actually got 58% of the vote for STV. But unfortunately, the government had put in a 60% threshold, so we lost. So I was listening to Howie talk about these difficult ballot access requirements, and those are heartbreaking, just how hard we have to work just to give voters a choice. But I can tell you, losing an election with 58% of the vote, I mean, I have still barely recovered, and it's been almost 20 years. Anyway, I want to mention all this because a lot of times reformers are talking about good ideas that they've read about. Good ideas that they've read about from an academic perspective, or perhaps they've heard someone speak at a conference. Good ideas with proven track records. And that's absolutely true for ranked choice voting and proportional representation. But I went from being someone who got excited by this idea to someone who has campaigned using STV, campaigned for STV, worked for New Zealand Green members of parliament under MMP, sat down with election officials in New Zealand to design the education materials about STV. I have campaigned and helped win people getting elected under STV in Australia. So I am taking this not just from a long-time 30-year Green Party activist, but also someone who has seen this put in place. And what I have seen is that when you have diverse viewpoints around the legislative table, it makes better public policy. It is really that simple. Representation matters. The lived experience of different people matters. It matters when they are making legislation, when they are representing people. And so for us to continue as a country to have single member, winner take all seats is a complete failure of democracy. So Fair Vote has put forward what they refer to as their gold standard legislation, the Fair Representation Act. And it's pretty straightforward. It's ranked choice voting in multi-member seats for Congress, ranked choice voting for Senate, those are single member seats. The congressional seats would likely be between 3 to 5 multi-members. By doing so, they're effectively clustering single member seats into a multi-member seat. And so that also helps address the issue of gerrymandering. So one of the things when I come back to the United States from campaigning all over the world is I come back and I start seeing these different maps, that these different districts that are carved out and created to try to predetermine a result, usually by partisan actors. So the Fair Representation Act is really trying to take that out of the hands of those partisan actors. They're trying to give the power back to the voters to, again, rank candidates in their order of preference. And they're doing so in multi-member seats so that seats can be won in proportion to level of support. So for example, in a 3-member seat, you would need to win 25% plus 1. And there are Greens all over this country who have gotten those kind of numbers. One of the things that struck me at the first Global Green Conference in Australia was how many Greens were elected as national members of parliament in their respective European countries. And what struck me is that so many of them received lower voting totals, lower support than many Greens here in the United States. The sole difference was the voting system. So I come from this with the idea that we need to break the two-party system. That is my analysis. We need to absolutely break open the two-party system, and proportional ranked choice voting is one of the best ways to do that. So I'm going to close with a bit of a challenge here. I absolutely want you to support the Fair Representation Act. Fair Vote has a number of amazing resources on their website. And again, I will post those in the chat. But as someone who is looking at people who are campaigning at the congressional level, state level, might be considering campaigning at the local level, what you want to do is look and see, are there options that currently exist in your area where there are multi-member seats? That could be a city council that has at-large districts. Because at the end of the day, from all my experience from 30 years, a good idea is not enough. So a multi-member seat is multiple seats. So a single winner district, a single member district, you're electing one person. In a multi-member seat, you're electing whatever number is determined. And in the Fair Representation Act, they're saying maybe 3 seats all at one time. Could be 4, it could be 5. That's my understanding, and Rob can certainly later, if I have that incorrect, correct me. So, sorry, I got distracted by the chat, which I said I would try not to do. So what I was saying is the challenge is to look at where there is a problem to solve. So in all my years of campaigning, the biggest thing that happens is that the no side, which is basically the status quo, what they have to do is hammer on like a single point, because better the devil you know. So we need to be solving a problem. It is not enough to be right. It is not enough that this might be a better or even the best system, in my opinion. What we need to be doing when we're presenting it to voters is to be defining that problem. And so that is a key thing that all of us have to do. Even before I got active with the Green Party, I was active with the PIRGs, the Public Interest Research Group, and they taught us you need to put the clipboard in their hands. So my challenge to people today is do your research, figure out what problem you're trying to solve, put the clipboard in their hands, and break open the two-party system. Thank you very much.
Go, Lynn. Yes. Great. Well, I guess we're handing it off to me then. Howie, your mic's not on, so I guess you don't have to introduce me. Hi, everybody. Mike Feinstein, Santa Monica, California. It's really an honor to be on this panel with these great electoral reform activists, and thank you for everybody who came. I think, as you know, the Green Party believes that democracy is enhanced by giving all voters a real opportunity to vote for and elect representatives who reflect people's views. And we seek a viable multi-party democracy with a full range of political parties on the general election ballot for voters to choose from, all with distinct platforms and policies that represent the diversity of political viewpoints within society. And as Lynne is talking about, an electoral system that allows all parties to run candidates and win legislative seats in proportion to the percentage of the popular vote. And that's why Greens want to replace legislative elections from single-seat districts with elections from multi-seat legislative districts by proportional representation, as Lynne just argued. Unfortunately, the biggest obstacle today to this change is top 2 and top 4 elections. Why? Because they misdirect rightful voter frustration with the current system into counterproductive reform using false anti-party narratives. And by them doing that, we risk losing the opportunity that comes with the historic moment that is a result of the growing dissatisfaction of the underrepresentation that comes from single-seat elections. How is that manifested? The 60% plus who poll that say they want a third party, the growing number of voters who don't affiliate with either major party, and the large percentage of voters, registered voters, who don't vote at all. Unfortunately, these top 2, top 4, top X systems are designed to maintain single-seat winner-take-all elections, but by creating conditions that weaken political parties and increase the role of big money in elections, while mostly wiping out minor parties even more than the current system does today. These top 2, top 4 systems do what? First, they eliminate party primaries and the ability of political parties to nominate their own candidates, and they eliminate the right of all ballot qualified candidates to place their nominees on the general election ballot. The ability to nominate our own candidates is something that is definitional for the Green Party, because as a movement party, we seek to practice what we preach by having a grassroots bottom-up movement choose our platform and our candidates. Instead, under top four systems, all candidates from all parties are forced into a single jungle primary, often with multiple candidates from many parties, 3 Dems, 3 Republicans, 2 Libertarians, 2 Greens, yada, 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 yada. The practical result that we've seen so far is that these top X systems funnel voters into voting for candidates from the major parties, yet they blur the lines of what those parties even stand for. This makes it even less likely that voters will have clear choices from among candidates and parties that represent a range of distinct policies and platforms. And this increases the cost of elections because now primary election candidates have to spend money to reach all voters in the primary, not just members of their party. So this is a direct blow. Not only does this favor big money, but this is a direct blow against minor parties that often build grassroots campaigns slowly in the spring and get stronger by the time of the general. So top four systems, top two systems, not only eliminate the automatic place that minor parties have on the general election ballot, but it expands the disincentive to vote for minor party candidates from the general election that we have today, where we have this so-called spoiler dynamic, into primary election seasons and spread it over multiple seats. Some people say, oh, well, top four is better than top two because there's more seats and maybe a minor party candidate can squeak through to the general. But the disincentive to vote green in the primary, if it's a top four system, maybe 2 Democrats are going to make it to the top 4. And if you are a progressive voter, you're going to give your primary election vote in many cases to the marginally most progressive Democrat, not the Green, in the hope that at least you'll get that progressive Dem into the top 4. So there is a great disincentive to actually vote for minor party candidates in these systems. And while it's true that in some races, there may not be a lot of major party candidates, so maybe a minor party candidate can make it to the general election, it is patronizing to parties like the Greens and their voters to say, oh, you have a chance to be on the general election ballot under these systems when we are already guaranteed a spot on the general election now, after we've gone through the very hard test of getting on the ballot for our party. And we're supposed to adopt now under top four, oh, a plantation mentality. Yes, sir. Thank you. Please whip me some more. Thank you so much for giving me a possibility to be on the general election ballot. And it's true, again, that, yeah, there will be some legislative races where there's not 4 strong candidates. But in important races, the likelihood is that there will be many strong candidates. And imagine that a top 4 system was in place for president, where it's not allowed right now by federal laws. Imagine now in this year, you'd have Trump, DeSantis, Haley, Cruz, Rubio, and other Republicans. For the Dems, you'd have Harris, Buttigieg, Newsom, Whitmer, others. No way a Green appears on the general election ballot. No way that a Green presidential candidate can be on the ballot like Jill Stein is likely going to be for us, raising issues the major parties won't touch or they're weak on. And then you think about that in statewide elections. What happens with us Greens is because we don't have a lot of resources, and often with other minor parties, is we spend our limited resources on getting on the ballot for a few statewide races so we have a chance to talk to all voters. But in a top X system where you have many major party candidates running, we're going to get wiped out and we're not even going to appear on a statewide ballot, and we won't be able to raise our issues and voters won't even hear about us. And let me give you a good example of why that's bad for the public debate that Lynne was talking about before. In California, we had a marvelous governor candidate in 22 named Luis Rodriguez. He was eliminated after the primary, and then right after that, our Governor Gavin Newsom from the Democrats extorted the state legislature to make an over $1 billion loan to keep the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant open until 2030, when it was supposed to be closed in 2025, and resources instead were supposed to go to efficiency and renewables. Now keeping it open until 2030 is going to expand to close to $12 billion. But there was no way for general election voters who could have voted Green at that time to express their displeasure with that dynamic, because Newsom waited to do it until after the election. So top X primaries are also problematic just when there's a large number of candidates, even from the major party, because you get so many vote splits in a primary election that it's very random who makes it to the top 4, or there's pressure for candidates to drop out, so there isn't a lot of vote splitting. And the darkest part of all of this is that the anti-party narrative to eliminate party primaries behind these top X systems assumes that the large number of non-affiliated voters reject the ideas of political parties per se. But it's the fact that voters aren't represented under the current system that causes them to reject what we have today. But it's not that they're rejecting the ideas of parties per se, but it's that there often isn't a party that represents them that has a chance to get elected in the general election. And that's the democratic deficit that must be addressed by real reform, not trying to re-rig somehow these single seat winner take all systems. So then we get to the question of RCV. And the problem with top four systems is they are hijacking a great idea of ranked choice voting and using it to push these undemocratic top four election systems. And the comparison is between Maine, which uses ranked choice voting in the general election after all of the political parties have nominated their own candidates. And this is also being proposed in Oregon this year. That preserves the idea that it's healthy for a democracy to place a wide range of worldviews before general election voters, views that are reflective of a broad range of society. And this, again, retains political parties' ability to put candidates on the general election ballot, and then they use ranked choice voting. It's a logical step from Maine's use of ranked choice voting, which again guarantees a general election spot for the nominees of all ballot qualified parties, to multi-seat elections by proportional representation, which embodies the idea that supporters of those parties all deserve legislative representation. The problem with these top X systems is that they are a form of party suppression. Party suppression is voter suppression, and voter suppression is a voting rights issue. Top four primaries are a concealed form of voter suppression that hijack ranked choice voting, because if it gets institutionalized, if these top X systems get institutionalized, we lose the idea that supporters of minor parties even get any voice at all. So this anti-party mentality that maintains that jungle primaries are preferable to party primaries is very dangerous for our democracy, because it misreads or intentionally misrepresents the frustration that voters have under our current system. And this is the difficulty that we're facing right now. And misleadingly, proponents of these primaries have called them open primaries. They're not. Open primaries are systems that retain party primaries, but allow any voter to choose to vote in a party primary of their choice. But instead of promoting an inclusive multi-party system, these top X systems take us further away and eliminate it. So we're in a position now where there's a lot of big money behind these top X systems. And yes, to be generous to some of the people backing them, they don't like how the current system is, and they think that they can play with it a little bit by using ranked choice voting and maybe get a slightly better result in the general election. To be less generous, this is a system now that makes it a more candidate and money-driven system, which means people who have big money have an incentive for these top X systems to go in instead of proportional representation, because they can have more interest in buying the results from these sort of systems. So in the end, when you look at the countries that the United States is most compared to, of the 38 Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries around the world, 33 of them use some form of proportional representation. And it's only the ex-colonial systems from the UK and one or two others that don't have some form of proportional representation. The danger, and I'll close with this, the danger with these top four systems is that it is going to lose the historic moment we have when massive numbers of people in this country feel unrepresented or underrepresented by the current system, and manipulate that rightful concern into a false premise of elections that maintain the status quo of single seat representation, which, regardless of even if it were to be improved, and this is not an improvement because it wipes out a lot of voter choice, even if it was a minor improvement, the reality is in single seat winner take all district elections, large numbers of voters don't get representation. They're left on the side. And therefore, everybody in society does not get a seat at the table of our democracy, which as Greens, We look from the ecology that everything is interconnected, and we believe that our governments need to reflect that interconnection by giving everybody a seat at the table of democracy. And that's why, as Greens, our national platform calls for opposing these kinds of systems and instead taking this historical moment, making the argument for ballot access, making the argument for public financing of elections, making the argument for debate inclusion for all ballot qualified candidates, and most of all, ranked choice voting for single seat winner take all elections where all political parties have a candidate on the general election ballot, and proportional representation for our legislatures. And and I'll close with this, if we move to a system with proportional representation for our legislature, then what will happen is, even in those races like governor and president, we will have more political parties that are viable and who have people who have served in the legislature who are very experienced and very talented. So even RCV single seat general elections will have a lot more choice if they are combined with proportional representation, because we will have a viable multi-party democracy with 5 or 6 or 7 viable political parties. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you to all the speakers. We're only 2 minutes over time, which is pretty good for Greens. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Lynn. So now we have about 35 minutes for questions and answers and comments. If you want to speak, you look down at the bottom of Zoom and it says react, and you push that and it says, where's the raise? Oh, raise hand. There's a raise hand function. Hit that, and then, yeah, I just raise my hand. And if the function's not working or you can't figure it out, put your question in the chat and I will try to get those included too. So Linda has her hand up, so let's start with you and then we'll go to Kira.
Yeah, hi. Linda Thompson from the Green Rainbow Party in Massachusetts. I'm so glad to hear this meeting today. It's so essential. And I've been coming to the conclusion that we've been very lax in launching a campaign for all the reforms that we're talking about today. In fact, it usually isn't even included in our candidates' public statements and press releases and so on. In other words, I feel we've been like slaves going out and getting all these, collecting all these signatures without raising hell about it sufficiently. Of course, the Green Party has a proud tradition of being one of the few that has done this until we're being joined more recently by Fair Vote and et cetera, and people like Winger and Ballot Access, News, et cetera. A lot of people have been fighting for fair elections, but there hasn't been a big public campaign for this. And I don't think the Green Party certainly can't do it by ourselves. We're too small, we don't have the money, but there are a lot of people who do have more numbers, more money than we do. And I put in the chat the link for the Left Elect brochure, which Howie and Jill Stein and I participated in 2015, where we brought together a broad array of left groups who were interested in advancing third parties and independent political action. That was the theme of that conference. And you'll see in there the broad list of sponsorship. However, we didn't break into the more liberal community that could be joined in this campaign. Jill and I have always wanted to see another conference like this, and she is in her campaign going around the country and talking to different people about possibly calling a coalition conference in the spring for fair elections. And since I've been kind of following any development in this area, I've took note of the fact that the American Bar Association is set up a task force for democratic elections. And they set it up as a so far as a bipartisan committee. And so I called and I got information on it, and trying to get support for it. I've worked with Jonathan Martin and Teresa Amato, which everybody knows wrote the wonderful book on the whole Nader vote suppression experience. And fortunately, she was able to go to the American Bar Association's conference in Chicago 2 weeks ago, and is trying to get on the task force for that, because if they leave that a bipartisan task force and campaign, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to reinforce and give the illusion of electoral reform if they don't include the third party aspect. So I'm saying,
So Linda, can you wrap it up? You've been going 5 minutes.
I'm saying all this to say, anybody who wants to be a part of this coalition we're trying to form should contact me, L Thompson 321. I'll put it in the chat. And we're going to start organizing for a big conference in the spring that will include all the forces we're talking about. It's got to be done. It's time, and people are fed up, and we've got to include the campaign in our electoral reforms. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Linda. We need to move on so everybody gets a chance to speak, but thank you. So Kira was next, and let's try to keep our comments are fine, questions are welcome, but keep it to 2 minutes so we can make sure everybody gets a chance. Go ahead, Kira.
Okay, hi, I'm Kira from Arizona. So essentially this last year, we have a local group that has been all about like ranked choice voting, but they've been circulating this petition trying to do like top 4 in the state. And I didn't sign it because I thought it was dumb. And I'm just not sure like what should we be doing if like we see something like that. Because I want to support the group overall, but I just cannot get behind this top 4 thing, you know?
Okay, why don't we get to Davi? And if there's a question, the panelists can respond, but go ahead, Davi.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Davi. I'm a presidential candidate with the Green Party since last year. So I'm glad to be talking to another former presidential candidate, Howie. Great to speak to you finally. I have been thinking about this issue since before I launched my campaign last year. And in the chat, I'm putting in the solution that we've been working on for the past 4 months with the Green Renaissance Committee and Green Liberty, as well as a couple of other presidential candidates, where we are presenting Human First America. It is a coalition of all political parties, all independent candidates, and saying that we will manage our own vote. That will allow us to no longer be at the whims of this billionaire class, but actually give us the voice to say, hey, this is actually what we want. And then afterwards, government can then implement it. It provides us the mechanism to create a 4th branch of government that is specifically based on the popular vote. So I would love to hear any responses or thoughts about that. And we are moving now. And so I'm very excited to share this with you all and looking forward to your response.
Okay, thank you. Paul Rubin is next.
Hi, yeah, so I'm a petitioner, new Green member, I'd say, maybe only the past couple of years, Green Party voter. And I did a lot of petitioning work for to get Joel on the ballot here in Connecticut. We're still unsure of whether it's going to happen. And one of you spoke, one of the presentators spoke to the difficulty, the amount of resources and time that it takes just to get candidates on the ballot, and it really feels like it's an obstacle that's designed for us to spend those resources and time, and just like the money, the the money restrictions. It feels like there are ballot restrictions as well. But the question that I had, I guess, for maybe the general panel is, because I do feel as if we live in an oligarchy, not a democracy right now. Who is, and I made the question in the chat, who's actually going to vote for these reforms, who's actually in power. Democrats seem, and Republicans, I would think, that we're both want to hold on to the stranglehold that they have over our electoral system, to refuse any other choice. To that respect, we tried to get RCV on Connecticut, in the Connecticut state hearings, and the Democratic leader, in the committee, just refused to actually hold a hearing at all about it, despite getting thousands or hundreds at least of petition requests. So I'm just curious about how do we get this, if we already don't think that we live in a democracy now, and I'm not sure that we do, how do we get democratic reforms? Thank you.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in writing columns, opinion pieces, etc., and getting them printed in newspapers. And newspapers have an incentive, when you're raising issues of representation, of supporting some controversy and having people question the system. So the opportunity, like if you were going to go speak about RCV, to have tried to get in the Hartfield Current or other places before you have a public hearing is a first step. And for the Green from Arizona, who'd raised that, I put into the chat, the Green Party of Colorado just put out a statement of their concerns with the top 4 measure, their excellent statement, and that was their press release. And that's something where you could draw some stuff from that and apply it to your case in Arizona. And on our resource page for this workshop, there's also the link of our national party statement there. So my main point is, you can get published in a whole lot of places, and especially now that there's, with all the stuff that's on web pages, there's even more places. Sometimes there are state political blogs that aren't hard copy newspapers, but really get a lot of the active people in that state to read them and approach those folks and query them and see if they'll take an article that's raising some of these issues. It helps your campaigning. Over.
Okay, Lynn.
Hi there. So I wanted to address the question about how do we get the people who are being impacted to be the ones to vote on this, considering we all know that the current elected officials, specifically from the Democratic and Republican Party, tend to act as not just gatekeepers, but really perpetuating this two-party system. And so it's a really good question. I tried to address it a little bit in my presentation with the idea of you have to think of a problem you're trying to solve. So for example, in 2006, when I worked with the New America Foundation and ran the 2006 Oakland RCV campaign, the problem they were trying to solve is that they were going from a 2-round runoff system to a single ranked choice voting election. And so we were saving money, we were saving time, and these are things that are a precious commodity for the voters. So I think a lot of it goes into how we are framing and positioning these reforms. And I will say that if we just talk about, oh, this is a way to get the Green Party elected, then no, in and of itself, we are not going to get enough support. Unfortunately, that's just where we are in our current environment. So we do have to build coalitions, which we've heard people talk about today, in which I know that a number of our candidates are definitely working on doing. But we do ultimately have to think about the voter. I think Rob used the term a voter-centered approach. And for me, one of the reasons I love proportional representation and I love the idea of preferential voting, which is another way to refer to ranked choice voting, because you rank candidates in order of preference, is that it is a very voter-centered approach. And I think that's one of the things that we have to go back and think about, which is what problem are we trying to solve? How are we going to make this relevant and of interest to the people, to the voters, and then kind of go from there. So I think it was a very good question. Thank you very much.
Okay, Rob.
Yeah, lots of good questions, and I'll just try to do a touch base on a few things building on what's been said. Connecticut actually has an interesting story because it's one of the states that has fusion voting. You know, Howie lives with that in New York State as well. But there are, minor parties have this option to cross-endorse major parties, and a sort of short-term minor party in Connecticut kind of engaged with the governor, Lamont, and actually got his support for ranked choice voting in exchange for giving him the endorsement. It's a tough state to win RCV because like the voting equipment's really old, and actually the presence of fusion voting adds complexity to what RCV looks like in November. But there's a task force that has been created. The governor seems to have actually gone from being willing to negotiate over to really like it, seemingly. That's what I'm hearing. And this task force is actually holding hearings. I testified to it. They're looking at kind of a relatively narrow way of starting to get RCV going, using it in primaries, allowing it in cities, allowing proportional RCV. There is a Connecticut Voting Rights Act, so that makes that kind of that much more interesting. So, something came out of it. It was progress. Tough to do these things in legislative states. But I will say Greens have often been super helpful in leading the efforts or triggering efforts or so on in city efforts. And almost all those city efforts got through to the ballot when they needed to get to the ballot through the city council or a charter commission. Mike's doing great stuff right now in Los Angeles. And there's sort of opportunities to actually work with the powers that be. Lynne, obviously, the Oakland story. And there are ways to find openings. And that's what we ultimately need to do in a lot of the country. I will say, from a minor party, organized minor party perspective, I top two on any party perspective is a real problem. But the more candidates you advance, the more with ranked choice voting in November, the more openings that you're created. Arizona is actually voting on top two, not top four, but the legislature can change it to up to 5. And so that'll be an interesting question. If top 2 passes, which is the worst way to do top X, there is actually an organizing opportunity to change that to top 5, which the numbers that I put in earlier show that in most legislative districts, that would actually be enough to allow an organized minor party to get to November and run in a ranked choice voting election. So it's sort of, there's sort of the world of compromise, but I will say third parties can also bargain with major parties sometimes. And we've seen that. The very reason why the major parties are doing all the hate and keeping people off the ballot actually means that sometimes they will talk about exchanging doing ranked choice voting in exchange for not running somewhere or some kind of opportunity, or working things out in conversation. So that's at least something to think about. And third parties do have that leverage of freaking major parties out, and that can be used to your advantage contextually. And actually, if the small parties sort of did that together more often, you get kind of libertarians from the right, Greens from the left, whatever. There's sort of change that can come from that.
Okay, before we get to another round, seems like the panel's all responded. I want to respond to a couple of the points raised. And I think Rob answered the question of how do we get the incumbents to go for these electoral reforms? And he said, you got to freak them out. You got to make it easier for them to agree than to disagree. And in a lot of cities, as well as states, we have the initiative process. So we don't even have to bother with them. We can go straight to the voters. But where we don't have that, or in addition to that, better, we can run our own candidates. And that does freak them out when we get a decent vote. My example is I got 5% running for governor in 2014 against Andrew Cuomo. And that was the most for a progressive third party going back to the Liberty Party in the 1840s, except for a couple socialists right after World War I who got a few tenths of a percent more than me. And Cuomo was freaked out. And as a result, he adopted key demands that we'd raised in the election because he thought, those were his voters. They went to me. And that included a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, and a big increase in public funding to the schools. And in fact, changed his whole brand from fiscal conservative to pragmatic progressive. Of course, he was corrupt. He's in disgrace now, but he changed. So we have that leverage, and we've won a lot of stuff. I mean, just take the ranked choice voting. I mean, Lynne coordinated the campaign in Oakland in 2006. Greens were central to the earlier one in San Francisco. And that kicked off this whole wave of reform that's been accelerating ever since for ranked choice voting. So we can win. The other thing I want to address this thing about the top four. To me, it's the party rights questions. The only way we're going to beat organized money is with organized people. And that means political parties. And when you can't even nominate your own candidates in a primary, and instead anybody who wants to run as a Green can, so we get, they have this in California with the top two. The party will designate someone as their nominee, and then other candidates will just pay the filing fee or the petition or whatever it takes and get on the ballot. And then Greens go to vote. They don't know who the party's supporting. So these are party destroying reforms, this, multi-partisan jungle primary, which they misname an open primary, which, as somebody pointed out, they got it in Hawaii. You got it pretty much in any state in some form or another. It's everybody's for open elections, open primaries, but this actually is a party destroying reform. That's my biggest concern about it, because, the Green Party, we want to be organized people beating the organized money, the oligarchy. And this reform makes it much more difficult for us to do that. So with that, Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I think since we're discussing this at our campaign convention, I think that we've got to encourage our candidates and all our members to really use this argument against the spoiler argument. I don't see it on social media that much. I don't see it in campaign pronouncements. It is the answer to the spoiler argument that the Democrats could do this overnight if they wanted to in many of the states. And I think the answer to the question, as Howie has indicated when he spoke, is the referendum. We need to get this on the ballot everywhere that it's possible to get this on the ballot. That's the way you do it. And in Massachusetts, we almost won. It was very close, but usually in the second or third time around, people get it. And I'm sure fair vote is on top of that. The other thing I think we don't stress enough to the spoiler argument is we are trying to build a party. 66% of people in this country want a third party, and that's what we're doing. That's the answer to why we're doing this. And it's rarely stated by our candidates. It drives me nuts. And a lot of the campaigns we come out of, we don't use all those contact lists that we get. And so, but again, I just want to repeat, the Green Party can't do it alone. We've got to build this coalition for the spring, and we have to crash the party that the ABA is conducting. We don't know what they're doing. I've got to get a fuller report from Teresa, who was there, but she spoke to the two co-chair of the task force, and they could be a powerful vehicle for change if we intervene and force them. Usually with liberals, you've got to force them to do things. They don't do things out of the goodness of their heart. So it's a big deal. I just want to stress that. I'll send out to anybody who emails me the motivation for the ABA development, and you can take a look at it and see what they're doing. But we got to be on top of that. We have to.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Mike, you got your hand up.
Yeah, just another strategic suggestion is that the most logical office to run for to promote PR and RCV in most states is Secretary of State, because that's the position, the statewide position that governs the running of elections. So when your state parties are looking to 2026, if your state has statewide elections, statewide constitutional offices that year, plan now and get somebody who's really good on electoral reform ready for that race.
So anybody else? I could go back and tell you about Putin's Russia and why they're almost as bad as we are. So, okay, Chris, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, from an organizing perspective, right, when we're in our local communities and we're having these conversations, there's always going to be multiple people in the room saying, let's take this compromise, right? Let's accept a top system, even though knowing, a lot of times they know, right? A lot of Republicans or Democrats don't have a strategic difference with us. They don't want us to exist. Like, that's where they're at. They don't believe there should be a voice to the left of them. And so when we're getting involved in these coalitions, it's really, and speaking in public, writing letters like Mike said, it's really important that we put that green perspective out there, right? Because there's always going to be people with power in the room who are willing to sell us out for appeasement. And we've got to make sure that there is a voice also in that room saying no, right? Too often, because we're not in the room, right? Because we're not, playing the game in a sense, no one says it, right? And when Mike was talking about the letters and things, right? Most major green policy points are incredibly publicly popular, right? Including democracy reform. But it's been hijacked, right? It's been hijacked by the very people who are, perpetuating the system that we have. The Democrats are out there running that they're going to save democracy despite being an active force against democracy. Yet they've got the microphone. So we've got to make sure in our communities that we're making sure that our voices are there too, right? That there's an independent voice there. And often just the existence of that voice means that they have to deal with us, right? That they have to at least start acknowledge our points and things like that. So, when this really, starts on the level of local organizing, which is where the Greens need to be focused. I did a whole workshop on it yesterday with local grassroots organizing. And so a part of that grassroots organizing is just being present and making sure that a green voice is out there, that a third party voice is out there, because the other side's voice is out there. So we need to make sure that we're at least offering the counterbalance. And what you'll find when we start doing that is that we have a lot of support. They may not come to the ballot box for us for many reasons, involving how terrible our electoral system is, that lead to them voting a strategically different way. But most people, when presented with our ideas, are supportive, even in debates. The people I've had, oh, well, your ideas would be great, but they're not advocating for them. So we've got to make sure we're there to advocate.
Okay. Asa has his, or Asa has his hand up. He hadn't spoken yet, so why don't you go ahead? After you unmute yourself.
First, commercial. I have two articles that was in earlier green papers called on taxpayer voter ID Act and on proportional on the Second Amendment, the second section of the 14th Amendment about proportional apportionment of the Electoral College. One of the things I've been advocating that the Green Party tried to lobby for is automatic registration for anyone who pays the federal federal taxes. And so when you pay your tax, on the form will be you be automatically allowed to register for any party and lobby for that to be part of the IRS form. I'm recommending that the Green Party sue the IRS to include something like this, say automatic registration for all people who file the federal income tax. That's not to replace other forms. And the rationale you use for that is that it's in keeping with the Voter Registration Act. It's another part to try to augment the Voter Registration Act by having everyone there's no way that no voter registration drive that you have that will have a greater impact and having the opportunity to, when you file your federal income tax, you also can register for whatever party you want to vote for. You know, so it's called automatic. If it with the short frame is if the document is good enough to take my money, it's good enough to take my vote. If it isn't, then give me back my money.
All right. Darby, let's make that the last question or comment in our allotted time period, and then we'll go back to the panel for their final thoughts. So, Darby, go ahead.
Awesome. I just want to reiterate the Declaration of American Human Governance and the Human First America Coalition, which is actively bringing us together in this next 3 months so that we can actually make a difference in what America's voice is. I think what I'm hearing in this conversation is that we are complaining about other entities, and we can actually be at the forefront of creating the solution. The Democrats and the Republicans are creating their version of what timeline will be fulfilled. And we have to be able to stand up and do that ourselves instead of saying, oh, we're just going to be another group that is complaining about what's available. So once again, buy.v.com/CAHG, please get involved now. We have the concentration and the opportunity with the Chevron deference that basically allows us to rethink and reimagine how federal agencies work, which means that we can rethink and reimagine how our elections work right now in the time when America is most frustrated about the presidential candidates that are from the major parties. So once again, thank you. And I look forward to hearing from everybody.
Okay, so for the panelists to wrap up, why don't we go in reverse order, which means we'd start with Mike.
I just want to refocus people on what Lynne Serpe said about what is the problem you're trying to solve. And as Greens, just because we're not doing well under this current system isn't going to convince everybody else of why we need electoral reform. The Fair Vote website has so many resources to help you think through, to understand the background on different reforms, think through how they can work best. But start with where Lynne is at. What is your local or state issue that you're trying to resolve? Generally, it's some larger question of lack of representation and how that plays out in your state based on the political and personal demographics. And then go from there, get some op-eds published about that. Think of who you have to lobby in your legislatures and run some candidates to make those cases to the larger electorate. Over.
Okay, next would be Lynne.
Well, thank you, Mike Feinstein. I appreciate the shout out. So for me, I said in the beginning, I think the problem is the two-party system itself. And I do think that actually the majority of people here in this country would agree. So I do think some of it is about messaging. Some of it is about identifying the problem, absolutely. But a lot of it is about mobilizing and focusing on this issue. When I tell people that my main area of focus within the Green Party is voting system reform, the number of times people's eyes glaze over and it's just not something that's going to get people in the streets, like a protest and things like that. So I'm excited to see how many people chose to participate in this workshop today. So thank you everyone for that. It really kind of gave me a boost. And I want us to take that energy and excitement back to our delegations. And I want us to really look at what we can do. Because as Howie said, we have actually made a difference. As Rob has said, the Greens have made a difference. These reforms are being talked about. I have seen more articles about ballot access in this election cycle than I think in the last 30 years total. So there is a moment that we've heard, but moments are also short. So just encourage you, as I said, get that clipboard in their hands and go break open that two-party system. Thank you.
Okay, well, to wrap up, I would emphasize one of the points.
You forgot Rob.
What?
I'll be super quick, Howie, but I'll inject my little
Rob.
thoughts. So I think actually Mike and Lynne covered things exceptionally well. And just to reinforce the points made in chat and verbally, Greens have been directly and hugely important in a number of wins. I think speaking to what Howie wanted me to address in particular about presidential elections, I do think the conversations that are happening, the pain that's being caused by, the alleged pain or the conversation about it in the swing states does create a conversation, does create an opportunity. And Fair Vote's going to be very attentive to that. There's a lot of good partner groups, by the way. We haven't talked a lot about them, but Rank the Vote and other groups out there that can be allies too. And there's a lot of state groups. So there is change that is available, and it can happen at all levels. And let's keep thinking big, because this is a time where democracy is in the conversation in a way it often isn't, and changing the rules of it are very much in the conversation. And there's so much more resources for it and so on. So. But keep the principled vision centered is a great contribution in itself.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Sorry I excluded you. I was so excited to say what I was going to say, which is the good news that we're winning this reform. We went into 2000 with 2 jurisdictions, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Arden, Maryland, a little town, that were legacies of the progressive era when they introduced proportional ranked choice voting, or the single transferable vote. Proportional representation. And then in this century, 21st century, with Greens providing the lead in places like San Francisco and Oakland, we expanded that to about 24 jurisdictions, 24 jurisdictions by 2020. Today, it's over 50 jurisdictions. And it's on the ballot in either for or against, 5 for, 2 against, I think at this point, for statewide. So this is a reform we're winning. So I think, let's, jump on this wave and provide leadership and be active. Now, I saw somebody in the chat ask about HR 1, and I'm not sure the context that came out of, but yeah, Mike's putting his hand down. We wrote some articles against it because HR 1 wanted to make it harder to get presidential campaign matching funds for primary matching funds. And in the later version, they just totally eliminated all public funding for presidential candidates, both the primary matching funds and the general election grant. And they weren't able to get that, but what they did do with a bipartisan vote as part of the, as part of the big spending bill in March, is they drained the presidential campaign public funding grant. So Jill Stein is qualified. She's applied. They said, you're qualified, but we're not going to give you the money because we might need it for the general election grants, which the major parties aren't going to take. It's about 120 million, and they're going to raise billions. And if they take that money, that public money, they can't raise the private money. So it's all a sham. And so she needs the money now to get on the ballot, and she's not getting it because of this runaround. I applied in 2020, and there wasn't even an FEC commission with enough people. They didn't have a quorum, so they couldn't give us the matching funds anyway. I mean, that's the kind of nonsense we're up against. So anyway, that was my comment on HR 1. So in general, I urge people, you got legislation you can promote this year in congressional races, whether or not you have a candidate. You got the Fair Election Act for fair ballot access, and we put that in the chat. You got the Fair Representation Act for proportional representation in Congress. Where do your candidates in your congressional district stand on that? Make it an issue. And then Rob, if you go to, I think we put it in our resources, but he had an article with some lawyers in the Harvard Law and Policy Review about going to ranked choice voting for presidential election. And there's an appendix with a ranked choice voting in Presidential Elections Act, which would bypass the Electoral College, and we wouldn't have to amend the Constitution. We just get the ranked choice voting for a national president. So check that out and bring that into your issues. And then, of course, what Mike was talking about on several states, you've got the top 4 or 5 question. And believe me, it's coming to your state. There are very wealthy people behind this move for multi-partisan or nonpartisan jungle primaries out of Silicon Valley, out of Wall Street. And so get ready. And then the third thing I'll say is go back to the program that's in the Venti list, or it's on the Green Party website. We had a whole number of resources, articles, and websites, so you can follow up on what we've been talking about today. So Our formal time is up, and I don't think we should stay past another 10 minutes because the next session will need to get set up. But I see Rob has his hand up, so go ahead, Rob.
I'll just be you summarized things super well, Howie. And thanks for reminding about the Presidential Act. I forgot about that particular cool idea, which actually can be done, but we don't have a vehicle yet for it. But there is a Ranked Choice Voting Act. Just want to say super fast that there are a negative scenario where a Republican trifecta federally based, because Ranked Choice Voting has a good chance to pass in DC, may pass a law banning that, but actually go further and just sort of try to stop RCV from federal races. We got to watch out on the defense side. Then the offense side, HR1 had that negative provision. There's talk about a Democratic trifecta doing something like it, but to do so, they would need every single senator and most House members to do it. So that gives a certain leverage to find some allies who would say, no, I won't support it if you put something like that in there, and ideally actually put in something that you really want, like some of the bills that we've talked to. So there are both defensive and offensive opportunities that may come out of this election.
Lynn, did you take your hand down or on purpose or by accident?
Well, I wanted to do something just on my PNC coordinator hat, just to remind people two things. If we don't have your delegation reporter, we need to have your delegation reporter. I put that link in the chat. Also, if you have not yet logged on into Lumio, you need to do so if you are a delegate. So please, 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 delegation reporters, we're missing them from several states, and there's quite a few delegates who have not yet logged on to Lumio, which is where we will be voting during the PNC tomorrow if you are a delegate. Thank you very much.
Okay, Nikita Londa, you hadn't spoken yet, so go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Lynn and Mike and Rob and you, Howie, for a tremendous presentation. And a question for Lynn, just a quick comment. When you mentioned that, I'm not the reporter, but how do I find out whether one of the other delegates has signed up already? Over. Thank you.
Lynn, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat again. So just go ahead and select that sheet and you'll see. I'm pretty sure Hawaii does have someone. Last I checked, Arizona, Ohio, New Mexico, Nevada. Those were some of the states that I know we did not yet have a reporter, but that's as of about an hour and a half ago because I've been a little busy since then. So thank you. But yes, please check the sheet, see if you have a reporter. I went and highlighted the states before I got on this call where we did not have one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, just a little more piece about the HR1 issue for those of you who didn't follow it and why going forward, if there's a Democratic trifecta, we're in trouble. The federal presidential primary public matching funds are legally allowed for minor parties to use to then try and get on the ballot for the general election. And because the ballot access standards are so difficult for minor parties because of rules passed by the Democrats and Republicans, the only way that our party qualifies for the ballot in many places around the country is by gaining those presidential matching funds. Now, of course, if they made ballot status much easier, as Howie's talking about, we wouldn't necessarily need to get all that money to pay for expensive ballot drives, but we do. And in 2019, Common Cause organization, which we think is there for good government and supports things we want, was willing to throw us under the bus and have the ability for minor parties to gain that money taken away, because that money was then promised to be used for congressional candidate matching funds, which was a goal of Common Cause, and we shamed them, and we publicized nationally how Common Cause was willing to screw us over, and they ended up stepping back from it a little bit. But there's no guarantee that if the Democrats get control next time around, in fact, the only guarantee we may have is that the Republicans, if the Republicans don't get the Senate, that they might use the filibuster to stop the Democrats from trying to push something through again that would just make it impossible for us to get any matching funds at all. And yes, in this cycle, they did it by gutting the fund, but look what they're doing to try and get us off the ballot elsewhere. So the point is, matching funds are necessary under the current ballot access system for minor parties like the Greens that don't get the bigger money that the Libertarians do to get on the ballot. And that is in the bullseye of the Democratic Party to get rid of us. And it's a critical issue because they hide it under other issues about voting rights. And it's very, it's uncool. Thanks for letting me add that.
Well, I see in the comments, we got a few more minutes. Gloria Matera says Common Cause threw us under the bus for ranked choice voting in New York City. And what happened there was Susan Lerner caucused with Dems behind closed doors while the coalition was protesting and lobbying. Yeah, they got ranked choice voting for the primaries, and the Democrats, had like a dozen candidates or 15 candidates, and they wanted to have a winner who wasn't getting 15% and winning in that big field. But when it came to the general election, they didn't want the Greens to be able to run without the spoiler effect. And that's what was going on. And I have to say, Susan Lerner on a public affairs program, statewide public affairs program, once said, oh, the Greens oppose us in California on every question. And I was shocked by that. And I looked up where Common Cause and the Greens stood on all the good government and election reform stuff in California. They have the same position. I mean, it just shows you that there's a whole nonprofit industrial complex funded by the liberal capitalists who support the Democratic Party, and they're very hostile to us. So that's why we need organized people in a party to take on the organized money. Go ahead.
What Susan Lerner was referring to is in 2008 and 2010 in California, when Common Cause qualified an independent redistricting ballot measure, we said it didn't go far enough because it preserved single seat districts. And even if they got independent redistricting in place, it wasn't proportional representation, and single seat districts are limited. So we were calling out the limitations to the reform, and Susan Lerner then took that as we're opposing them.
Not to add a whole nother complexity, but I'll just say that New York has fusion voting, which was alluded to earlier, as does Connecticut, and the parties like the Working Families Party that's very invested in fusion voting are fighting against ranked choice voting in the November election because they think it makes fusion voting harder. So they're actually opposing ranked choice voting in Oregon, and we're kind of a tipping point problem for winning ranked choice voting in New York through the Charter Commission for the general election. It actually lost by only, I think, one vote on the Charter Commission to not put it on the ballot for general elections, but that's part of the issue. So we need to work out that one. Oregon actually does have fusion voting where you don't get a separate ballot line, so it still allows the minor party to be engaging and nominating more candidates, but it doesn't have that separate ballot line, and that's enough for the Working Families Party to be opposing it. So
the irony is that the founding father of the Working Families Party, Danny Cantor, used to say fusion voting is a bastardized form of proportional representation. Of course, we always said, well, let's go for the real thing, but that's ironic. Yeah. So Michelle, you probably be the last person because we're running out of time. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who spoke because it's been really uplifting, and I just feel so much more confidence in the changes coming. So thanks, everyone. That's all.
That's a good point to wrap up on. So thanks everybody for being here. We had good attendance. I think about 40 people in all.
50.
50.
Yep.
Okay, great. So have a good rest of the Green Convention.
Bye-bye.
Aloha. Thank you, Mike, Howie, Rob.
Lynn.
Lynn left already. I told her thank you.
Okay, good. Oh, there's Tim Laidman. Wow. All right. And Charlie Wilkin. Oh, great. Woof.
Chris, your presentation yesterday was great. Thank you.
Thank you. I am about to turn on the waiting room, which will kick everybody out, or send them to the waiting room, I think. And then
Yeah,
I
I'm
gotta
leaving.
I gotta go do another one at 3:45.
Okay, anyway, I just wanted to say thank you. Aloha.
Thank you. Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention, you know, I'm happy to Zoom in with folks and talk about that kind of stuff. So whenever you got meetings or whatever. But thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn the waiting room on, and the next one should be starting shortly. If you get kicked out, just come back.
Chris,
Yep.
can you hear me? I've had a heck of a time getting into this and I don't want to get kicked off. So what do I do to stay in for the next program? I'm seeing your face on the screen now, but I want to stay in so I can get into the next